My name is Jesse Hamlin. I'm a master's in GIS alumni from the University of Redlands in California. I just graduated in August. And before I get started, I just wanted to thank Mark and Tom and the committee for allowing me this great opportunity to come in and present to you guys. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about my master's project for the year, which was oil and gas infrastructure security in Africa. So all of us students at the university were paired up with a real-world client. My client for this project was the Sierra Nevada Corporation. They're an aerospace company located in Washington, D.C. And my point of contact there was Jim Wickman. SNC was being contracted, or currently is being contracted out by SOCOM, the United States Special Operations Command. It's a branch of the U.S. military. And initially what they were interested in being able to do is map out existing oil and gas infrastructure and assets. So things like pipelines, refineries, natural gas terminals, and wells, of which they had information on but little to no spatial information. They were interested in doing this for two specific study areas. The first is the continent of Africa itself, and second, the countries of Algeria in northern Africa and Mozambique in sub-Saharan Africa. So let's take a look at some international examples of oil and gas infrastructure accidents. So the first type are natural accidents. So we have things like earthquakes at refineries, lightning strikes on oil rigs, and hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. So hurricanes such as Hurricane Ike, Katrina, they can really do a lot of damage to both the onshore and offshore oil and gas infrastructure. The next type is technological. So things like natural gas terminal explosions. Another example is the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill from a few years back. And lastly, we have the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska back in the late 1980s. The last type is intentional. So things like refinery attacks, pipeline attacks, and what's going on off the coast of Somalia with a lot of the oil tankers being hijacked. So really, these intentional types of attacks, these were the focus of this master's project. So some recent news articles. At least 37 hostages killed in Algeria gas plant standoff. This is what's known as the In Amenas attack in Algeria in January 2013. 800 people were held hostage over the course of 3 days, and ultimately 37 people lost their lives. Nigeria militants claim attack on Shell pipeline. 2 Americans among those kidnapped on a raid on Nigerian oil rig. It's not just off the coast of Somalia where piracy is becoming an issue, it's also off the coast of Nigeria where a lot of the offshore oil platforms are being held hostage. So let's take a quick look at the system design. It was created to meet the needs of the client. It's composed of 4 different data types. The first is base map and administrative data from ArcGIS Online. We have some detailed infrastructure data that was purchased from a third-party vendor. And we also have low detail infrastructure data, which is primarily free data available on the web. Lastly, we have conflict data, so 3 separate databases were acquired for this project, showing things like terrorist attacks and conflict information, protests, things like that. All this information was compiled, transformed, converted, reprojected into a standardized file as Regio database, upon which tools from ArcGIS Spatial Analysts were used to help identify high and low risk areas of oil and gas infrastructure attack for the client. All this information was pushed up to the cloud and a web service using ArcGIS Online and the ArcGIS Web App Builder. From here, the client's able to view data, but also go in and import their own data sets. So let's take a look at some of the variables that were used and some of the inputs for this risk mapping. The first is exploration data, so things like oil and gas fields, onshore and offshore deposits, and existing geological oil and gas basins on the continent of Africa. Infrastructure data, so we have things like natural gas terminals, crude oil refineries, and pipelines from various different sources. We also wanted to be able to model population and transportation information, so proximity to major urban areas, proximity to major highways, infrastructure. And I mentioned to you earlier there were three separate databases acquired for the project. So this shows social unrest over the continent of Africa over the past 23 years. There's 16,056 records here. So this is not necessarily oil and gas related information, but what it does do is kind of gives us paints a sense of a picture of where social unrest is occurring within the individual political boundaries of each of these countries. So from here we can filter that information into just oil and gas information using keywords such as oil, gas, petroleum, energy, pipeline attacks, things of that nature. So this, for example, is just a keyword search on oil, and it brings up a record that shows us that a group of ex-militants attacked an oil pipeline operated by a private corporation. So these are the types of records that we're looking for. So from that, we end up with filtered information into just oil and gas related infrastructure attacks over the past 23 years. There's 150 records that you see on your screen. So in the interest of saving time, I just wanted to show you, like I showed you before, some of the previous variables that were used as the input model. So that model was based on a standard spatial risk methodology based on a professor of Utah, Thomas J. Koba, in 1999, called GIS and Emergency Management. If you want more information on how the final outputs were derived, please contact me after the presentation. So this was used, there was 20 variables. I showed you about 5 or 6 of them, but there's actually about 20 that were used to create one of the final deliverables for the project, which was a standard final risk map. So what you see on your screen are areas of high and low oil and gas infrastructure risk. These are the areas that a potential attacker would potentially be going after. So areas in red are very high risk, areas in white or light pink are low risk. So from this we can start to paint a bit of a picture as to where the activity is occurring based on the data, and it's occurring in countries like Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Nigeria, and Sudan. So these are really the areas that the client should be focusing, but not just these countries, also the individual areas within these countries are where the client's able to focus on. So I want to talk to you real briefly about the web application using the ArcGIS Web App Builder beta from Esri. It's hosted using a University of Redlands public web server, an ArcGIS online organizational account. Again, the client's able to upload their own data, and it's viewable from mobile devices such as iPads, Androids, and iOS devices such as iPhones. So let's take a quick look at the application in action. So when the client logs in, they're provided with, before they log in, they're provided with several different credentials based on their individual users, groups, and roles. So this is kind of the interface when they first log in. And what you see on your screen are all of those different conflict or terrorist attacks on infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure, over the past 23 years. So from here, the client's able to drill down a little bit further and get additional information on each one of these individual events. So for example, in Ethiopia in 2006, gunmen attack and kill a foreign oil worker, resulting in 1 death. Similarly, in Egypt in 2011, attackers destroy a gas pipeline outside of Cairo. So the client's also able to view that risk map that I showed you earlier. And again, if you want more information on how this was produced, I'd be happy to explain after the presentation. So the client also has access to infrastructure information. So things like pipelines, refineries, and natural gas terminals. For example, this is a pipeline running through Africa. What's one of the major pipelines in Africa? It's called the Trans-Saharan Pipeline. From this, the client's able to click on a link that brings them to an open source online oil and gas wiki called Encyclopedia, where they're able to just get a little bit of additional information on this particular pipeline. The client can also look at perhaps the status of some proposed development projects. So for example, in Sudan, there's a proposed pipeline. They're able to click on a link that brings them to a website that perhaps would give them a little bit more information, whether the pipeline's completed, still proposed, in development stage, or whatnot. This is a refinery in Nigeria. It's got 110,000 barrel per day crude capacity. So all this information is available to the client. I mentioned to you earlier there was some additional detailed data purchased from a third-party vendor for the project. So the client has access to this information as well. Using the bookmarks toolbar, they're able to drill down a little bit further into a country of interest, Mozambique, and from there into a facility called the Tamain Natural Gas Facility. So again, they can just get a little bit more information on this natural gas processing facility. Using the Esri base maps library, they can also just kind of turn on the imagery and get a bit of a greater ground level feel for how the infrastructure lies on the ground, how a potential attacker would go about accessing this particular facility. So this is just one example of how you could use this application. So I'm going to wrap up here. Just some quick conclusions for the project. A spatial database was compiled for the client, Sierra Nevada Corporation and SOCOM, of which they had little spatial information at the beginning of the project, so that database was delivered to the client. A web mapping application was created to house that data and be able to allow them to view and upload information. And a spatial risk assessment was conducted, in which the major findings were that there were 5 primary countries that the client really needed to focus on, those countries being Nigeria, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, and Sudan. Thanks.
Okay, we have time for some questions. I'm going to be the first, though, to ask. I'm curious,